In the heart of Venice, a palace rises on the waterfront. Inside, grand halls reverberate with the triumphs of empire, while deeper within, torture chambers echo with darker deeds. The most powerful men in the world become prisoners of their own gilded cage here in Venice's Palace of the Doge. In the week before Lent, the streets of Venice are alive with carnival. Amid the frivolity, it is easy to forget that Venice was once as powerful as she is enchanting. That she made a city from a marsh and an empire from the sea. That all the riches of the East passed by her watery front door. In her heyday, adventurous citizens like Marco Polo traveled to the other side of the world to befriend Eastern despots like Kublai Khan. Behind the revelers, a reminder of those days of glory still stands. The palace that was once the fulcrum of a great sea empire. Built when Europe was erecting squat, defensive castles, it perches lightly on its graceful arches, gazing ever outward to the seas that made Venice wealthy beyond belief. This is the Palace of the Doge, built to house the long line of men who occupied one of the strangest seats of power ever devised. Elected to office by a vast council, the Doge wore on his head something less than a crown, called a corno. It symbolized an office severely restricted by a nobility fearful of monarchies and ever jealous of the balance of power. The system worked. For 1,000 years, no man seized absolute power, earning Venice the name La Serenissima, the most serene republic. But the reign of the Doges was anything but serene. Under one of them, in 1202, Venice reached her turning point. His name? Doge Enrico Dandolo, 88, bent with age, and stone blind. Europe had become used to Venetian leaders of limited power, but none so clever. For Dandolo was about to use them to transform his most serene republic into the glittering capital of a third of the known world. Venice began as a city of refugees. The barbarian invasions of the 5th century drove Roman citizens to the marshy edges of the Adriatic. While mud and malaria kept the barbarians at bay, the Venetians learned the dazzling art of building on water. Without an architectural leg to stand on, they drove oak pilings into the shifting mud and dredged the channels in between. 60 churches and countless houses keeled over into the lagoon before the Venetians got the hang of it. The city's shipbuilders proved as ingenious as her architects. Soon, the merchants of Venice were venturing into the Aegean and beyond. Her market stalls overflowed with the bounty of the Adriatic and the silk and spices of the Orient. Much of her wealth came through an enormously profitable truce with the Muslims, an arrangement that galled Christian Europe as it emptied its coffers mounting crusades. But Europe swallowed its pride. French knights needed Venetian ships for yet another crusade. Thus, in 1202, they had little choice but to court the Doge Dandolo. "We come in the name of the barons of France," they said. "They implore you to furnish ships so that they may pass the seas." Dandolo replied, as only a Venetian could, "On what terms?" The wily Doge then talked his way into leading their army, but he still needed the Republic's approval. From the pulpit of his basilica, Dandolo played the part of a humble public servant. "I am an old man and feeble, but I see that no one could command you like myself, who am your lord." Their approval was resounding. With Dandolo at its head, the fleet sailed, but it never reached the Holy Land. Another prize became more alluring. Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire. A contender for its throne sought the Crusaders' aid in a battle for succession. Dandolo smelled profit and a chance for revenge. Legend has it he was blinded here. His ships turned north. In the attack that followed, some Crusaders ran amok in an orgy of pillage and plunder. Others stood back in horror that Christians were killing Christians. And the Venetians, they calmly calculated their share of the spoils. Most of the loot ended up here, at the Basilica of St. Mark, the Doge's own church. One of the oldest surviving parts of the palace, the Basilica illustrates Venice's long-standing penchant for things Eastern and its willingness to steal what it could not buy. For this church was built to house the most holy theft of all, the remains of the city's patron saint, Mark the Evangelist. In 828, his body had been smuggled from Egypt, hidden by Venetian merchants under slabs of pork, so Muslim customs agents wouldn't look too closely. To that prize, Dandolo added his own Byzantine plunder, marble arches, columns transplanted intact, and priceless sculpture. To the Basilica's gold altarpiece, or the Pala d'Oro, Dandolo adds Byzantine enamel portraits of prophets and angels. These would later be set, along with a fortune in sapphires, rubies, and emeralds, in a huge block of gold. The most famous of the Byzantine spoils are the 4 horses stripped from Constantinople's famed hippodrome. There they had been harnessed to a chariot, but Venice set them free to stride proudly from the basilica's facade. The symbolism wasn't lost on the rest of the world. Venice would no longer be reined in. She had stolen half an empire. No longer just a rich port, Venice was now an empire herself. Since the 9th century, the Doge's palace has stood where Venice's Grand Canal runs into the Molo, the lagoon. Not until the 1340s did the palace begin taking its present shape, with the construction of the facade overlooking the Molo. With the great Enrico Dandolo long gone, it announced a further weakening of the power of the Doge. For this wing of the palace housed the swelling ranks of bureaucrats. Occupying most of the new wing was the hall of the Great Council, Venice's supreme ruling body, made up of the entire aristocracy. The Great Council spared no expense in drafting Europe's best artists to inspire them. From his throne, the Doge oversaw the proceedings, his every move checked by a phalanx of councillors. In front, up to 3,000 aristocrats crammed the great chamber, debating and voting themselves ever-increasing control over state affairs. Many a Doge grumbled, but only one rebelled. In 1354, an ominous fog accompanied the ascension of a new Doge, Marino Faliero. Already forced by the council to sign away still more power, the proud Faliero suffered further humiliation. One of the nobles penned an obscene poem about his wife. The council only laughed, not Faliero. Quietly, he plotted to massacre them all and have himself declared Prince of Venice. But the council's spies caught wind of his plot. No one, not even a Doge, would threaten their supremacy. In the end, Faliero lost his corno and his head. His remains were left dangling from the top of a marble staircase. In their great hall, the council made an example of Faliero's folly. Amid the portraits of the more cooperative Doges, one is draped in black. Here is the place of Marino Faliero, beheaded for his crimes. But the council did not stop there. 10 of Faliero's conspirators were hanged from the palace windows. For one, the palace became an ironic scaffold. Chief architect Filippo Calandaro had been at work on the south wing until the day of his arrest. Annoyed by the architect's treason, the Great Council was nevertheless pleased with his handiwork. A fantastic layer cake of Gothic colonnades and statuary, combining Christian imagery with Islamic design. At the other end of this wing is the great Gothic archway known as the Porta della Carta, the paper gateway. Here, a petitioner could hire a scribe to write up his appeal in bureaucratese. Petition in hand, he mounted the giant staircase, a name referring not to its size, but to the figures of Mars and Neptune at its top. On this landing, each new Doge was sworn in. On entering the palace, important visitors might be admitted into the magnificent Collegium Hall, where they could ponder the works of Tintoretto and Veronese, and possibly be received by the Doge himself. In the hall beyond, an increasingly emboldened Senate reigned. With the Doge subdued, the noblemen now turned their attention to controlling the public, or tried to, as their edicts sometimes bordered on the ridiculous. Be it determined that no hall living in Venice may dress in gold, silver, or silk, and such women may not wear necklaces, pearls, or rings, either in their ears or in any other imaginable places. At nuptial feasts, not more than one course of roast and one of boiled meat may be provided. Banned from all banquets shall be trout, pastries, and all other things made of sugar. Such edicts were greeted with disdain. Venice was having too good a time to pay heed. But there was a ruling body within the darker recesses of the palace they dared not ignore. One whose power was cloaked in secrecy and whose deliberations were a matter of life and death. The serene Republic owed its longevity not only to a keen business sense, but to a vigilance bordering on paranoia, embodied in a tyrannical group known as the Council of Ten. Fed by a network of spies, its assassins terrorized not only Venice, but all of Europe. Some accusations arrived anonymously, slipped into slots called lions' mouths found throughout the palace, helpfully marked for secret denunciations. Through concealed passageways and dark rooms, the information was processed, unburdened by public scrutiny. Trials, even lives, were dispensed of with cool efficiency. Some found guilty would be led to sweltering attic prisons, others to dungeons below. Still others were marched to cells across a walkway called the Bridge of Sighs. Within this prison, the condemned etched their despair in stone. From the man I trust, may God defend me. From the man I trust not, I will defend myself. Another said simply, learn to suffer. In 1755, the prison received its most famous inmate, soldier, spy, diplomat, and lover, Giacomo Casanova. Charged with heresy, he was brought to trial before 3 men more feared than even the Council of 10, the State Inquisitors. In holding cells beside the torture chamber, those waiting their turn before the Inquisitors were treated to a chilling preview of the proceedings. The Inquisitors sentenced Casanova to 5 years, convinced they would extend his sentence to life, if not execution. Casanova plotted his escape. One night, he broke out of his cell and made a spectacular scramble across the palace rooftops to freedom. By boat, he fled to France, where he resumed a life of unbridled excess. By then, Venice herself was very much like her debauched Casanova. European nations had broken her trade monopolies and drained her political power. No longer a force to be reckoned with, Venice seemed content to squander her riches on parades and pageantry. The greatest role of the Doge now was figurehead. He had become a virtual prisoner in a gilded cage. His letters were censored, his contact with foreigners restricted, and he could only leave Venice under guard. From France, Napoleon Bonaparte observed what Venice had become. He pronounced her the finest drawing room in Europe, and sent his troops to seize it. On May the 12th, 1797, in the great council chamber, the 120th and last Doge removed his corno and set it aside, declaring, "I shall not be needing it any more." Poets and romantics the world over mourned Venice's fall. Lord Byron yearned for a return of the ancient rascal who so craftily thrust Venice's greatness upon her. Oh, for an hour of old blind Dandolo, Byzantium's conquering foe. La Serenissima, the most serene republic, was no more. Yet, for her thousands of visitors, Venice remains serenely magical. Poised impossibly on her lagoon, few can arrive at the Molo, glimpse the Grand Palace, and not be moved to agree with the poet who wrote 500 years ago. So long as the clear skies contain stars, so long as the human race carries on its generations upon the earth, the splendor of the Venetians will be celebrated for all eternity.